The last translation she finished that night was French, a philosopher's essay on the nature of loneliness. How fitting. Because when the philosopher's words finally blurred before her eyes, Kira Nichols set down her pen, pulled a fresh sheet of ivory paper toward her, and wrote something she had no business writing at all. No addressee, no signature, just the truth she had been quietly carrying for 2 years, the kind that accumulates in a person who spends more time watching the world than living in it. She wrote about the Duke of West Ham. Not the title, not the estate, not the cold, impenetrable legend the Ton had constructed around Joseph Sanders like a stone wall. She wrote about the man, the one she had noticed at a dozen society gatherings, while everyone else was too busy performing their own importance to look. The man who arrived at every ball as if fulfilling a sentence, who stood near the tall windows, never quite inside any conversation, holding his glass with the careful stillness of someone who had learned long ago that wanting things only made the losing of them worse. She wrote that she thought he was the most profoundly alone person she had ever observed in a crowded room, and that for 2 years that quiet devastation had lived in her chest like a second heartbeat. She meant to burn it before morning. She meant to feed it to the fireplace and pretend she had never been foolish enough to put such dangerous honesty onto paper. But Alice had other plans. Her younger sister, perpetually rushing, perpetually careless, had swept up the letters for the morning post in the grey half-light before Kira was even properly awake, and somewhere in that breathless bundle, tucked between a dressmaker's invoice and a note to their aunt in Bath, went Kira's private confession, sealed, addressed to no one, sent somehow to the one address in all of London it should never have reached. She only discovered the catastrophe 3 days later, when the house was still and dark, and Mrs. Parrow, their housekeeper, unshakable Mrs. Parrow, came to her bedroom door with a voice Kira had never heard from her before. Low, frightened, careful. "Miss Nichols, there is a carriage outside." Dark, Kira would later remember. Everything about it was dark. The lacquered coach, the midnight hour, the breath of fog curling beneath the gas lamp. And standing on her front steps in the cold London rain, holding a single sheet of ivory paper as though it were evidence at a trial, was the Duke of West Ham himself. Dark eyes, unreadable face, patient in the way of a man who has already decided he is not leaving. Now, before we go any further, I need to ask you something. If the person you had quietly understood for years, the one you'd never dared approach, appeared at your door at 3 in the morning, holding your most unguarded truth, would you hide behind that door, or would you finally let yourself be seen? Tell me in the comments, and if Kira's story is already living in your chest the way her letter lived in his, you know what to do. The brass knocker fell 3 times. Each strike landed in the chest before it reached the ears, deep, deliberate, unhurried. The knock of a man who had never once in his life needed to knock twice. Kira stood at the top of the staircase in her nightgown, one hand gripping the banister, the candle in her other hand, throwing nervous gold light across the walls. Below her, Mrs. Parrow stood at the foot of the stairs, looking up with an expression Kira had never seen on the woman's face in 6 years of service. Not quite fear, something closer to the feeling you get when the weather changes before the storm is visible, that animal awareness that something large is approaching and there is nowhere reasonable to run. "He has not moved," Mrs. Parrow said quietly. "He is simply standing." Kira descended 3 steps, stopped. Did he say anything? Only his name, a pause, as though that were sufficient. It was. That was the worst part. It absolutely was. She made herself go down. The hallway felt longer than it ever had before. past the side table with the wilting arrangement Alice had forgotten to replace, past the oval mirror where Kira caught a single terrible glimpse of herself, dark hair loose around her shoulders, eyes too wide, the look of a woman who had been caught in the precise act she'd spent 2 years carefully avoiding, being noticed. She stopped at the door. On the other side of it, Joseph Sanders, the Duke of West Ham, peer of the realm, the coldest man in any room he entered, 4 years a widower, 15 years a mystery, and, as of 3 days ago, the sole reader of the most honest thing she had ever written in her life. Kira pressed her palm flat against the door, felt the cold seeping through the wood from the other side, felt the rain, she could hear it now, a soft, indifferent curtain of it against the steps, against the street, against a man apparently too proud or too furious to step under the portico. She opened the door. The gas lamp above the entrance caught him in fragments. The dark greatcoat, shoulders carrying the rain like armor, the severe line of his jaw, the hair slightly disordered, not dramatically so, just enough to suggest he had dressed for the hour with purpose rather than care, and his eyes. She had studied them across a dozen ballrooms and always concluded they were impossible to read. She was correct. Even now, at 3 in the morning, standing uninvited on her father's steps with her private soul folded in his hand, those eyes gave her nothing. Except that he had come, at this hour, in this rain, that was, she understood, with a slow dropping weight in her stomach, a great deal of something. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he held up the letter. The ivory paper was slightly softened at the edges from the damp, but the ink, her careful translator's hand, held perfectly. It always did. Kira had a horror of words that bled. "You wrote this," he said. It was not a question. His voice was lower than she remembered from the few public addresses she had heard him give, as though he had stripped some professional layer from it on the drive over, the way one might remove a coat before a difficult conversation. What remained was unhurried, quiet, precise in the way of a man who had decided before he arrived exactly how much he was willing to say. Kira lifted her chin. It was the only sovereign gesture available to a woman standing barefoot in her nightgown before a duke. "You are standing in the rain, Your Grace." "I am aware." "It is 3 in the morning." "Also aware." She waited. He did not move, did not offer to step forward, did not retreat, simply remained, a study in deliberate stillness, and watched her with those unreadable eyes while the rain came down around them both and London slept on, indifferent and unknowing. "You tracked my handwriting," she said, less an accusation than the quiet arrival at a conclusion she had been resisting since Mrs. Parrow knocked on her door. Something moved across his face, too brief to name. "You have a distinctive hand, and you translated Moreau's 3rd volume last spring, the dedication page." A pause. "I have it in my library." Of course he did. Of course it had been that. 2 years of careful invisibility, undone by penmanship and a French philosopher. Kira looked at the letter in his hand, at the way his fingers held it, not carelessly, not the way one holds a document or evidence or a weapon, though she had half expected one of those. He held it the way one holds something that has caused an unexpected injury, carefully, as though uncertain whether to set it down. "I did not intend to send it," she said, the truth, and a small mercy, and all she was willing to offer him at 3 in the morning on her doorstep. The Duke of Westham looked at her for a long, still moment. The rain gathered in the folds of his coat. The gas lamp held them both in its imperfect circle of light. "No," he said at last, and something in his voice had shifted, just fractionally, just enough. "But you intended to write it." He let that land where it would. And Kira, who had spent 23 years translating other people's words into something true, found for the first time in her life that she had absolutely nothing to say. She let him in because the alternative was worse. Not worse in any practical sense. Mrs. Parrow was a formidable woman. The hour was scandalous by any measure, and every rule of propriety Kira had ever been taught suggested that the correct response to a duke on one's doorstep at 3 in the morning was a firm, polite, and immediate closing of the door. But practicality had ceased to govern the situation the moment she saw his face in the lamplight. There was something in it, beneath the controlled stillness, beneath the reputation and the title, and the careful armor of a man who had survived grief by becoming unreachable, that stopped her. He looked, she thought, like a person who had not slept in 3 days. She stepped back from the door. She put him in the front sitting-room because it was the furthest from the rest of the household. Mrs. Parrow lit 2 additional candles without being asked, and then stationed herself in the hallway with the silent, immovable authority of a woman who had decided that propriety would be observed even if it had to be observed from 12 feet away. Kira set her own candle on the mantel and turned to face him. He had not sat. She had not expected him to. He stood at the center of the room with his coat still on, the letter held at his side, and studied the space around him with the brief, assessing glance of a man accustomed to entering rooms and immediately understanding their architecture. Then his eyes returned to her. "How long," he said, "have you been watching me?" Direct, no preamble, no social scaffolding. She found, oddly, that she preferred it. "I have not been watching you," Kira said. "I observe. There is a distinction." "Enlighten me." "Watching implies intent. A hunter watches. I simply—" She stopped, tried again. "I am a translator, Your Grace. I notice the things people do not say. It is occupational habit." Something flickered behind his eyes. "And what is it you believe you did not hear me say?" It was a precise and somewhat dangerous question. Kira folded her hands in front of her, not from composure, but because they needed to be occupied, and held his gaze. Outside, the rain had softened to a murmur. The candles breathed. "You arrived at every event this season between 7 and 7:15, never later, never earlier. You stayed no longer than an hour and a quarter at any gathering, regardless of its social significance. You refused the card tables. You accepted introduction to no one under the age of 45. You always found the window." The Duke had gone very still. "At the Pemberton dinner in March," she continued, because she was already undone, and there was a particular freedom in that, "the window faced the east garden. There was nothing remarkable in it, a topiary, a gravel path, a stone bench. You stood there for 11 minutes, and when Lady Pemberton approached you, you turned back to the room so smoothly that she never realized you had been somewhere else entirely." The silence that followed was the particular silence of something that cannot be unsaid. Joseph Saunders looked at her as though she had just reached into his chest and rearranged something without his permission. The controlled expression held, barely, but she saw it now, the cost of that control, the slight tension along the jaw, the way his hand tightened almost imperceptibly around the letter. "You wrote," he said, and his voice was lower now, deliberate in the way of someone choosing each word from a very small, very carefully guarded supply, "that you thought I was the loneliest person in any room I entered." "Yes. You wrote that it broke something open in you." Kira did not look away. "Yes." He crossed the room, not toward her, but past her, to the window that overlooked the dark street, and she understood that it was not a retreat so much as a necessity, that he needed briefly to be the one doing the observing. She waited. "I have attended 41 social engagements in the past year," he said, to the glass. "My secretary keeps the record. 41. I have smiled at the correct moments, discussed the correct topics, been seen to be—" A pause. The word seemed to cost him something. "Recovered." He turned from the window. "Not one person," he said, "in 41 evenings and 4 years of very careful performance has written me a letter suggesting otherwise." His eyes found hers across the candle-lit room. "And then you, a woman I have, to my knowledge, never exchanged a single word with, put the whole of it onto paper as though you had simply walked through a wall I have spent 15 years building." It was the most she had ever heard him say at once. She suspected it was the most he had said to anyone in a considerable while. "I am sorry," Kira said, and meant it. "It was never meant to leave my hands." "That," he said, "does not actually answer my question." She looked at him, at the rain-damp coat and the tired eyes and the letter he still had not put down, and she thought of the philosopher's essay she had been translating when the impulse to write had overtaken her. The burden of the unwitnessed life. She had translated that particular phrase 4 times before she was satisfied with it. "I wrote it," she said finally, "because I was tired of watching someone drown slowly in a room full of people who had convinced themselves the water was not rising." Joseph Saunders said nothing, but something in his face, just for a moment, just briefly enough that she might almost have imagined it, came undone. He left before 4. Not abruptly. There was nothing abrupt about Joseph Saunders, she was learning. Everything he did was measured, as though he had long ago decided that the world would receive from him only what he deliberately chose to give it, and not a fraction more. He simply reached the end of whatever he had come to say, looked at her for a long, unreadable moment, and inclined his head in a way that managed to be simultaneously a goodbye and a question left deliberately open. The letter he took with him. She noticed that, turned it over in her mind long after Mrs. Parrow had bolted the door and the sound of carriage wheels had faded into the wet London dark. He had arrived holding it, and he had left holding it, and she was not entirely sure what that meant, only that it meant something. She did not sleep. Alice came down to breakfast at 8:30, looking entirely untroubled by the universe, which was, Kira reflected, her younger sister's singular and most maddening gift. She was 19, pink-cheeked, and currently absorbed in a letter of her own, something from her friend Charlotte, judging by the lavender seal, and she reached for the toast rack without looking up, humming something vaguely recognizable beneath her breath. Kira set down her teacup. "Alice." "I need you to think back to last Tuesday morning." Alice looked up, read something in Kira's expression that caused her to set Charlotte's letter slowly down. "Why?" "The post." Kira kept her voice even, measured. She had been practicing the tone since approximately 4:15 in the morning. "You took it out, before I was awake." A pause. Alice had the grace, at least, to show the precise moment the memory arrived. It moved across her face like weather, breezy unconcern giving way to a small, dawning cloud of recollection. "I was in a terrible rush. Charlotte had written that her mother was expecting a reply by Wednesday, and I had completely forgotten to—" "How many letters did you take?" "Just mine, and—" Alice stopped. The cloud darkened considerably. "There was a bundle on the writing desk. I assumed they were all for post. Were they not all for post?" Kira looked at her sister across the breakfast table, across the toast rack and the marmalade, and the cheerful morning light that had absolutely no business being as cheerful as it was. "One of them was not." The silence lasted 4 full seconds. "Kira," Alice's voice had dropped to something hushed and genuinely alarmed. "What was in it?" "Nothing that concerns you." A pause. "Everything that concerns me." She went to the writing desk after breakfast and stood before it for a long time, reconstructing Tuesday with the methodical attention she usually reserved for a particularly knotted passage of French prose. The desk's surface told its own story, if one knew how to read it. The organized stacks of her translation work on the left, Moreau's 4th volume, half finished, her personal correspondence in the center, neatly bundled, and there, on the right, where she kept the pages she had not yet decided what to do with, empty. She pulled open the lower drawer, found the rest of what should have been that bundle. 4 pages of notes on subordinate clauses, a discarded opening paragraph she'd written for an essay that never became anything, and the envelope, the twin of the one she had addressed to Aunt Margaret, same ivory stock, same size, sealed in the same absent-minded moment before she'd understood what she was doing. Except that one was still here, and the other was in a duke's coat pocket somewhere in Mayfair. She sat down in the desk chair and pressed her fingers briefly to her eyes. It was the handwriting that had finished her. She understood that now. She had understood it in fragments last night, standing in the sitting room while Joseph told her, with that careful, quiet voice, about the Moreau translation. But it settled fully this morning, cold and complete, like a mathematical proof arriving at its final, inevitable line. She had a distinctive hand. Her father had told her so since childhood. You write like someone who means every word, Kira, which is admirable and occasionally inconvenient. Her pen instructor at 16 had called it elegant but idiosyncratic. The publisher who had commissioned the Moreau translations had noted in his acceptance letter that the dedication page bore handwriting of unusual character, and had asked charmingly whether she would consent to signing the limited edition. She had consented. Joseph Sanders had that edition in his library. She thought about that, about the particular geometry of fate required to bring all of this into alignment. 2 years of careful invisibility, a philosopher's essay on loneliness, a sleepless midnight, a weakness of the pen, a sister in a hurry, and one translator's hand that apparently announced itself as unmistakably as a name on a calling card. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her, looked at it, wrote 3 words, "Dear Miss Nichols," and then stopped, because even a practiced sentence with no content or consequence, looked irrefutably, inescapably like her. There was something almost funny in it, if one were the sort of person capable of finding things funny at 9 in the morning, after no sleep and a midnight visit from the coldest duke in London. Kira was not, at present, that sort of person. She put the pen down. Behind her, Alice appeared in the doorway of the study with the careful tread of someone approaching a situation that may or may not require an apology, carrying 2 cups of tea as a preliminary offering of goodwill. "I brought—" "Sit down, Alice," Kira said, without turning around. Alice sat.
The invitation arrived on Thursday. It was written on cream cardstock, the handwriting precise and unhurried in the manner of someone who had never once in her life been rushed by anything, including time itself. The wording was brief. "Mrs. Emily Sanders requests the pleasure of Miss Piran Nichols' company for afternoon tea, Friday, 3 o'clock, Harwick House, the East Drawing Room." No elaboration, no explanation. The kind of invitation that understood itself to be, in all practical terms, a summons. Kira read it twice. Then she read the name again. Sanders. She set the card down on the writing desk with the particular care one uses when handling something that may or may not be dangerous. Mrs. Emily Sanders was 61 years old, had outlived 2 husbands, and was widely regarded in London society as the sharpest mind in any room she entered, a reputation she had cultivated with great patience and absolutely no apology. She was Joseph's father's sister. She had, by most accounts, raised him through the worst years of his adolescence after the elder Duke's death, and she remained the one person in his orbit whom he appeared to regard with something approaching uncomplicated warmth. She was also, Kira realized the moment she was shown into the East Drawing Room and found those calm grey eyes waiting for her, entirely aware of the midnight visit, every last detail of it. "Sit down, Miss Nichols," Mrs. Ennerly said pleasantly, in the tone of a woman who had already decided how the afternoon would proceed. "The Darjeeling is already poured." The room was beautiful in the way of spaces that have been lived in honestly, not arranged for impression, but settled into over decades of genuine occupation. Books stacked on side tables without apology, a needlework frame by the window mid-project, flowers in a vase that had been chosen for their scent rather than their arrangement. Kira noticed all of it in the automatic way she noticed everything, and felt, despite herself, slightly less afraid. Mrs. Emily let the tea breathe for a moment, let the silence do its preliminary work. "You are wondering," the older woman said at last, "how much I know." "I am wondering," Kira said carefully, "how much he told you." A small approving nod, the nod of a woman who appreciated precision. "More than he has told anyone in 4 years, which gives you some indication of how thoroughly your letter dismantled him." She lifted her cup, regarded Kira over the rim with those level grey eyes. "He did not come to me directly. He came to the library, which is what Joseph does when something has disturbed him. He goes to stand among the books as though the problem might resolve itself if he simply waits it out. I found him there at 6 in the morning with your letter on the table and the look of a man who has just been handed evidence of something he had convinced himself did not exist." Kira kept her hands still in her lap. "What evidence?" "That he is still legible," Mrs. Emily said simply, "that beneath everything he has built and barricaded and made deliberately impenetrable, there is still something a perceptive person can read." A pause. "That terrified him considerably more than any scandal ever has."
They drank their tea. A clock on the mantel marked the silence in small, patient increments. Outside the window, the Friday afternoon moved through its ordinary business, carriages, voices, the distant sound of a vendor's call, indifferent to the conversation being conducted 3 floors above the street. "I did not write the letter to disturb him," Kira said. "I wrote it because—" She stopped, found the honest version. "Because I could not stop seeing what I saw, and I had nowhere else to put it." "I know." Mrs. Emily's voice was not unkind. It was something more useful than kind. It was straightforward. "That is precisely what concerns me, my dear." Kira looked at her. The older woman set down her cup with the quiet deliberateness of someone arriving at the part of the conversation they came to have. "Joseph is not a careless man. He is not impulsive, he is not frivolous, and he does not do anything without having first understood completely what it will cost him." She looked at Kira steadily. "He came to your door at 3 in the morning." "Yes. He has not come to anyone's door at 3 in the morning since Eleanor died." A brief pause, not for effect, but for accuracy. "What I am telling you, Miss Nichols, is that you should understand the nature of the man you have written to. Joseph does not approach things halfway. He does not investigate and then withdraw. When he decides something matters—" She paused, choosing the words with the care of someone who has watched a thing long enough to describe it precisely. "He holds it long past the point where another person would have let go." The clock marked another small interval. "That is either a very great quality or a very serious warning, depending entirely on whether you intend to be worth holding on to." Her grey eyes were direct and not unkind and absolutely clear. "I am not asking you to answer that question to me. I am asking you to answer it to yourself, before Friday becomes Saturday, and Saturday becomes something neither of you has the social armor to survive." Kira thought of the letter, of ivory paper held carefully in a careful hand, of a man standing in the rain who had not once in the entire length of their encounter looked as though he intended to leave. "What if I do not yet know the answer?" she asked quietly. Mrs. Emily considered this with the patience of a woman who had lived long enough to respect an honest uncertainty. "Then," she said, refilling Kira's cup with the calm authority of someone extending an afternoon that needed extending, "you had better start deciding." The Ashworth Gala was, by every measurable standard, the most significant social event of the season. 300 guests, 2 orchestras, a ballroom renovated specifically for the occasion with imported Venetian mirrors that multiplied the candlelight until the entire room existed in a kind of gilded excess, every surface reflecting every other surface in an infinite, dazzling loop. Lady Ashworth had been planning it since October and intended, as she had informed anyone willing to listen, for it to be remembered. Kira arrived with Alice and their cousin Margaret at 8:30, accepted a glass of champagne she had no intention of drinking, and positioned herself in the most professionally invisible location available, a slight recession near the second pillar on the east wall, partially obscured by an ambitious floral arrangement, with a clear sightline to the room and no particular obligation to be seen by it. She was, she told herself, simply attending, as she always did, observing from a comfortable and sensible distance. She was not looking for anyone. She saw him at 9 o'clock. He came in the way he always came in, without announcement, without the faint performance of arrival that most guests unconsciously employed, no pause at the threshold to survey the room and be surveyed in return. He simply entered as though the space were something to be moved through rather than inhabited, and within 60 seconds had declined 2 introductions, deflected a third, and found his way to the perimeter of the room with the unerring instinct of a man who understood his own geography. He was in dark evening clothes. He looked, as he always looked, entirely self-contained, a complete and finished thing that required nothing from its surroundings to be what it was. 3 debutantes tracked his movement across the room with the focused attention of young women who had been briefed extensively on the Duke of West Ham's annual income. He did not look at any of them. Kara looked back at her champagne. He found her at 9:20. She knew the precise moment he registered her location, not because he moved toward her immediately, but because he did not. There was a fractional stillness, a reorientation, the almost imperceptible adjustment of a compass needle finding north. And then he continued his previous trajectory for another 4 minutes, exchanged a few words with Lord Pemberton, accepted a glass of something he also did not drink, and arrived at the second pillar on the east wall as though he had been heading there all along. He came to stand beside her, not facing her, both of them facing the room, side by side, looking out at the orchestras and the mirrors and the 300 people performing the elaborate social theatre of a London season. "Miss Nichols," he said. "Your Grace," she replied. A comfortable silence, or something that wore the shape of a comfortable silence, though Kira was aware of every inch of the distance between them with a precision that had nothing comfortable about it. "You are hiding," he observed. "I am observing. From behind a flower arrangement." The arrangement is incidental. She heard something in his breath that might, from a less guarded man, have been a quiet laugh. It was gone before she could be certain. The orchestra finished one piece and began another, a waltz, slow and deliberate, the kind written for ballrooms exactly like this one, all candlelight and consequence. The floor filled with couples assembling in the unhurried way of people for whom dancing was a language they had always spoken. "You do not dance," she said. She had observed this across multiple seasons, and stated it now not as a question, but as a catalogued fact. "I do not," he agreed. "Neither do I." A pause. "Professionally inadvisable. One cannot observe a room one is actively participating in." This time the sound was unmistakable, brief, low, genuine, a laugh that appeared to surprise him slightly, as though it had escaped some internal checkpoint before he could review it for approval. He turned his head to look at her, just fractionally, and she felt the weight of it against the side of her face. "You are," he said quietly, "entirely unlike anyone I have spoken to in recent memory." "You have not spoken to very many people in recent memory." "No," he said, "I have not." The waltz moved through its first phrase. The mirrors gave back 100 versions of the same candlelit scene, couples turning, the room breathing, and at the east wall, slightly apart from all of it, two people standing in the comfortable margins of a party they had both attended and neither had come for. "My aunt tells me," Joseph said after a while, "that she invited you to tea. She did, and that you acquitted yourself admirably. Kira considered this. She told you that? She told me you were honest." A pause, which, from Mrs. Emily, is the only acquittal that carries any weight. She turned to look at him then, directly, which she had been carefully not doing for the past 20 minutes. He was looking at her, not with the unreadable blankness of his public face, but with something quieter and more considered, the look, she thought, of a man who was paying attention in the way she understood attention, not performing it, but genuinely, privately, giving it. The waltz was reaching its close. Around them the room sparkled and chattered and turned, and no one, in the magnificent self-absorption of a London gala, was paying the slightest attention to the Duke of West Ham and the translator's daughter, standing together in the shadows of the east wall. "They will notice eventually," Kira said softly, "that you are standing here." Joseph looked back out at the room, at the debutantes and the mirrors and the 300 people who had constructed between them an elaborate and mostly fictional version of who he was. "Let them," he said.
The ride was not planned. That was the part Kyra would return to afterward, not what was said beneath the willow, not the quality of the afternoon light, not even the particular silence that preceded the most honest thing Joseph Sanders had ever said to another living person. What she would return to was the unplanned nature of it, the way it had assembled itself from ordinary pieces on an ordinary Tuesday, as though the conversation had been waiting patiently for exactly the right set of unremarkable circumstances in which to occur. She had been walking in Regent's Park with Alice, who had lasted approximately 20 minutes before meeting Charlotte Vane near the fountain and drifting away in a tide of urgent, half-whispered social intelligence. Kyra had continued alone along the eastern path, book in hand, in the particular state of contented solitude that was her natural habitat. The carriage appeared at the park's edge at 2:30, dark, familiar, unhurried. Joseph stepped down before it had fully stopped. They walked for a while before either of them spoke, which suited them both. The park was generous with its silence, wide enough and green enough to absorb the city's noise and return something quieter in its place. The afternoon was pale gold, the kind of English autumn light that apologizes for itself even as it arrives, as though aware it cannot stay. He had brought 2 horses. He gestured toward them with the easy assumption of a man accustomed to having logistics resolve themselves, and Kyra, who had ridden since childhood and was wearing, fortunately, sufficiently practical clothes for it, did not object. They rode east along the quieter paths until the park opened onto a stretch of grass that sloped gently toward a shallow pond, its bank draped by a willow tree so old and so extravagantly proportioned that it had apparently decided the pond belonged to it. Joseph dismounted at the water's edge, and Kyra followed, and they stood for a moment in the curtained quiet beneath the willow's hanging branches, while the horses drank and the city continued its business at a considerable and merciful distance. "Her name was Eleanor," he said. No preamble, no careful construction of approach, just the name, offered into the afternoon air with the directness of a man who had decided at some point between the park gate and the willow tree that half measures were no longer available to him. Kyra did not move, did not speak. She had learned in 4 years of translating other people's thoughts into new languages that the most important skill was knowing when to be entirely still. Joseph continued, looking out at the water. She was 23. It was not a love match in the beginning. Our families had known each other for a generation. It was sensible and well regarded and thoroughly arranged. A pause.
And then it became something else entirely, gradually, and then suddenly, the way those things do when you are not paying careful enough attention to defend against them. The willow moved softly overhead. A single leaf released and fell, turning once, landing on the surface of the pond without a sound. She died in the winter of her 27th year, he said. A fever. 4 days from first symptoms to... He stopped. The jaw tightened briefly, released. 4 days is not enough time to prepare for the permanent absence of a person. I am not certain any amount of time is sufficient, but 4 days feels, in retrospect, like a particular cruelty.
Kira thought of the philosopher's essay, The Burden of the Unwitnessed Life. She thought of every ballroom she had watched him navigate with his careful, exhausting performance of recovery. She thought of the window at the Pemberton dinner, the East Garden, the stone bench she had looked at for 11 minutes without seeing. The grief I could carry, Joseph said quietly. Grief is comprehensible. It has weight and shape, and one learns eventually to distribute it. He turned from the water to look at her then, and his face held none of its public architecture, no controlled distance, no ducal composure. Just the thing beneath all of that, tired and honest and entirely unguarded. What I could not carry was the wanting. After Eleanor, I removed it, systematically, deliberately. Every preference, every anticipation, every small morning thought of the variety, I should like to tell her this. I identified them and I ended them, one by one, until the wanting stopped entirely. He paused. I was rather thorough about it. I know, Kira said softly. Yes. Something moved through his expression. That is rather the problem. He looked back at the pond. The willow held them in its green and private quiet. Your letter, he said, after a long moment. I have read a great deal in my life. I have read philosophy and legal argument and correspondence from men far more educated and considered than a young woman sitting alone at midnight with ink on her fingers. He stopped. When he continued, his voice had dropped to something she had to be very still to catch. I have never once read anything that knew me. Not a single word in 38 years that looked directly at the thing I had become and named it without flinching. He turned to face her fully beneath the willow's canopy. That, he said, is why it broke me. Not because it was painful, because it was true. And I had spent 4 years constructing a life in which truth of that particular variety had absolutely no place left to enter. The horses moved quietly at the water's edge. The afternoon light held. Kira looked at the man standing before her, stripped for once of every layer the world had given him to wear, and felt something in her own chest answer the precise frequency of what he had just said. She had written the letter because she was tired of watching him drown. She was only beginning to understand that she had been, in her own quiet and bookish and carefully defended way, drowning too. She did not answer him immediately. That was not avoidance. It was the particular honesty of a person who had spent enough time working with language to understand that the wrong words, even well-intentioned ones, could do the work of walls. And she had built enough walls. She suspected they both had. The last thing she intended to do, standing beneath a willow tree on a Tuesday afternoon with the most unguarded version of Joseph Sanders she had yet encountered, was reach for the nearest comfortable phrase and hide behind it. So she was quiet for a moment, let the pond and the light and the old willow hold them while she found the true version. I was 11 years old, she began, when I translated my first proper sentence from French. Joseph watched her, said nothing. He had learned, she noticed, the same quality of stillness she employed, the art of making space for what someone actually meant to say. It was a line from Rousseau. My father set it as an exercise. He believed languages should be lived in, not merely studied. She paused, looking out at the water. The sentence was simple enough on its surface, but when I reached for the English equivalent, I found that there was no single word that carried everything the French contained.
I had to make a choice, which truth to keep and which to sacrifice in translation. She turned to look at him. I have been making that particular choice ever since. Every manuscript, every essay, every commissioned passage, deciding which truth survives the crossing. And the letter? Joseph said quietly. The letter, she said, was the first thing I have written in 23 years that did not require translation. The willow shifted above them. A breath of wind moved across the pond and was gone. Kira had rehearsed nothing. That was perhaps why it came out cleanly. No prepared edges, no diplomatic softening, just the thing itself in its original language. I wrote it because I was exhausted, she said. Not by you, by the watching, by the particular helplessness of a person who sees something clearly and has no sanctioned means of saying so. She folded her hands in the way she always did when they needed occupation, then deliberately unfolded them, a small private act of stopping herself from retreating into composed habit. In polite society, one does not approach a duke, one does not remark upon his grief, or his solitude, or the way he holds his glass at a ball like a man who has forgotten what he is supposed to be doing with it. One observes these things, and one says nothing, and one goes home and translates Rousseau, and pretends that the watching does not accumulate. But it accumulated, Joseph said. Considerably. A pause. 2 years is a long time to watch someone disappear by degrees. His expression shifted, not dramatically, not with any of the visible emotional machinery that lesser self-control might have permitted, just a deepening of attention, a quality of listening that had moved beyond the polite into something altogether more present. You wrote, he said slowly, that you wished someone would stand beside me, not because of the title, because of me.
Yes. Did you mean yourself? The question landed in the quiet afternoon and stayed there, honest and direct and entirely without malice. Just a man who had decided, somewhere between a midnight doorstep and a willow tree, that the oblique approach was a luxury neither of them could afford. Kira looked at him, at the grey eyes that had finally, over the accumulation of these weeks, begun to show her what they contained, at the careful face that was, at this moment, not careful at all. I did not allow myself to mean anything when I wrote it, she said at last. That was the condition under which I permitted myself to write it at all. No intent, no hope, simply observation, recorded honestly, addressed to no one. She paused. I have spent my entire adult life in the margins of other people's stories, translating them, annotating them, making them legible for audiences who will never know my name. Her voice was even. She was not performing composure. She simply found, to her mild surprise, that she had arrived somewhere past the point where composure was necessary. It did not occur to me when I wrote those words that I was also describing something I wanted. And now, Joseph said. The willow was still. The pond held the pale sky in its surface like a second world, quieter and more honest than the one above it. Now, Kira said carefully, I find that the professional habit of observation has rather let me down, because I can see with complete clarity exactly what is happening. I can name every stage of it, catalogue every relevant detail, trace the whole progression from an anonymous letter to a Tuesday afternoon beneath a willow tree. She met his eyes. And none of that analytical competence has done a single thing to protect me from it. Something changed in Joseph's face. Not broke, that had already happened, 3 days after a letter arrived that he had no business receiving. This was different, quieter, the particular expression of a man watching something he had stopped believing in walk back into the room. He reached out and, with great deliberateness, tucked a loose strand of dark hair back from her face, a gesture so small and so careful that contained in its restraint more than a great many larger gestures might have managed. I have been standing beside windows for 4 years, waiting for something I could not have named.
Kira felt the truth of it move through her, the way the best translations always did, not arriving from outside, but rising from somewhere she recognized. "I know," she said. "I was watching." And for the first time since a candle burned down to nothing and a pen found paper at midnight, Kira Nichols stopped observing the story from the margins. She stepped into it.
The letter to Thornfield Park arrived on a Wednesday. Kira did not know about it until Thursday, which was, she suspected, entirely deliberate. Joseph Sanders was not a man who announced intentions in advance of executing them. She had come to understand this about him the way one comes to understand the grammar of a new language, not from instruction, but from sustained and careful exposure. He did not speak of what he planned, he simply acted, and let the action speak with the precision he trusted words to lack. It was Mrs. Emily who told her. Appearing at the Nichols townhouse on Thursday morning with the calm authority of a woman delivering information she considered the recipient fully entitled to, she accepted a cup of tea, settled into the chair by the window as though she had been sitting in it for years, and said without particular ceremony, "Joseph has gone to Wiltshire." Kira set down her translation pen. "I beg your pardon?" "He left yesterday morning. He will be at Thornfield Park by this evening, weather permitting." Mrs. Emily regarded her with those level grey eyes over the rim of the teacup. "He has gone to speak with your father." The sitting room was very quiet. Outside, London continued its Thursday business. The clatter of a delivery cart, voices from the street below, Alice practicing something imperfectly on the pianoforte 2 rooms away. Ordinary sounds, the texture of an ordinary morning, surrounding a piece of information that was neither ordinary nor small. "He did not tell me," Kira said. "No." Mrs. Emily's voice was not without sympathy. "He did not want you to feel the weight of waiting. He felt—" a slight pause, the pause of someone selecting a word he had actually used, "that it was his thing to do and yours to receive, in that order." Kira thought about that, about a man who had spent 4 years removing every wanting thing from his life, getting into a carriage at dawn and travelling 3 hours into Wiltshire to sit across from a retired scholar and ask, with whatever combination of directness and dignity Joseph Sanders was capable of, which was, she suspected, a considerable amount of both, for the permission to court his eldest daughter. She found she had to look at the window for a moment. Thornfield Park in autumn was the closest thing to peace that Leo Nichols had discovered in 61 years of vigorous and largely cerebral living. He had retired there from his professorship at Oxford 8 years prior, filled the house with books and correspondence and a vegetable garden of extravagant ambition, and received visitors with the selective enthusiasm of a man who had earned the right to choose his company. He received the Duke of West Ham in the front study at 4:30. Joseph had rehearsed nothing. He had decided this somewhere on the road out of London, watching the city give way to the cleaner geometries of countryside, that a rehearsed version of this conversation would be the wrong one. Leo Nichols had raised Kira, had shaped, presumably, the very quality of mind and character that had produced a letter capable of dismantling 38 years of careful self-containment. A prepared speech would not serve. Honesty was the only currency likely to be respected in this house. He sat across from the older man, compact, bright-eyed, with Kira's same quality of complete and unhurried attention, and said without preamble, "I expect you have questions, Mr. Nichols." Leo looked at him for a long considering moment, set down his pipe. "Just one at present," he said. "Sit down, Your Grace. You have been travelling since morning, and you are making the room feel effortful." Joseph sat. They talked for 2 hours. Not the abbreviated procedural conversation of a formal courtship request, the kind conducted in polished drawing rooms between men performing the social choreography of aristocratic alliance. This was something else. Leo Nichols was not interested in title or estate, or the considerable practical advantages that attached themselves to the Duke of West Ham's name like barnacles to a ship.
He had read enough of the world and enough of human nature to be entirely unmoved by those. What he asked about was Eleanor. Joseph had not expected that. He answered it anyway, because the alternative was a dishonesty he was no longer willing to practice, and because Leo asked the question with the careful, unflinching directness of a man who understood that the past was not a thing to be managed, but a thing to be known. He spoke about the marriage and the loss and the 4 years that followed, about the systematic removal of wanting, about a letter that had arrived on an otherwise remarkable morning and dismantled in 3 pages of ivory paper the entire architecture of his self-possession. He spoke about a woman who stood at east-facing windows and understood what she saw, and who had, without intending to, reminded him that he was still a man with a life to be lived, rather than a title with obligations to be discharged. Leo listened to all of it without interruption. When Joseph finished, the study was quiet enough to hear the fire settle. "She will not be managed," said Leo at last, "not as a warning, as information offered with the pride of a father who has watched a daughter become precisely what he hoped she would. She has her own mind, and she keeps her own counsel, and she will tell you, clearly and without cruelty, when you are wrong." "I am counting on it," said Joseph. Something in Leo's expression resolved itself, a long private calculation reaching its conclusion. He reached for his pipe, looked at the man sitting across from him with the calm, complete attention of someone who had just learned what he needed to know. "Stay for dinner, Your Grace," he said, "and tell me what your intentions are, plainly, without the title in the way." Joseph looked at the older man, at the bright Kira-like eyes and the unhurried intelligence and the quality of a person for whom honesty was simply the only language worth speaking. "Plainly," he said, "I intend to spend the rest of my life being seen by your daughter." Leo was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled, slow, genuine, the smile of a man who recognizes, after 61 years of reading both books and people, an honest sentence when he hears one. "Well," he said, "that will do." The morning of the ceremony was grey and gentle, which suited them both. Not the dramatic skies of Gothic romance, no theatrical storms, no portentous light breaking through cathedral windows at the precise moment of the vow. Just a quiet English November morning, doing what quiet English November mornings do, which is to arrive without fanfare and settle over everything with a soft, unhurried permanence. Kira stood at the window of the small dressing room at St. Tammans and watched the light move across the stone courtyard below, and thought, with the particular clarity that arrives only in genuinely still moments, that she would not have changed a single detail of it. Alice was crying already. She had been crying on and off since Tuesday. "You are not allowed to be composed," Alice informed her, pressing a handkerchief to her eyes with one hand and straightening Kira's sleeve with the other. "It is your wedding morning. Composure is entirely inappropriate." "I am not composed. I am thinking. That is worse." The church held perhaps 40 people. Joseph had suggested a small ceremony, and Kira had agreed with a promptness that made Mrs. Emily, when informed, produce one of her brief, satisfied nods, the nod of a woman whose assessment of the situation has been confirmed by subsequent events. No grand society occasion, no 300 mirrored guests performing attendance, no elaborate display of the kind that would have required both of them to spend the day maintaining the public versions of themselves they had spent the better part of an autumn carefully dismantling. Just the people who knew them, the ones who had, in their various ways, been present for the real story, rather than the version the tongue would eventually construct from rumor and inference and the considerable mythology that attached itself to the cold Duke of West Ham doing anything as unexpected as falling in love. Leo Nichols sat in the front pew with the settled, quiet contentment of a man who has read the last page of a book and found it worthy of the journey. He had travelled up from Thornfield Park on Friday, arrived at the townhouse for dinner, and spent the evening in the kind of conversation with Joseph that Kira recognized from the quality of both their silences afterward as the beginning of a genuine and mutual regard. Mrs. Emily sat beside him, wearing a shade of deep blue that suggested she had given the occasion precisely the right amount of ceremony. She had, characteristically, nothing to prove and everything to observe. Joseph was already at the altar when Kira entered. He turned at the sound of the door, which she thought later was very like him, not waiting in the prescribed forward-facing position of ceremonial patience, but turning immediately and without self-consciousness toward the sound of her arrival, as though the ritual could wait, but the actual moment could not. He looked at her the way he had looked at her beneath the willow, without the public architecture, without the careful, constructed distance that had made him, for 4 years, the most unreadable man in any room he entered. Just the grey eyes and the undisguised attention of a person who had decided on a rain-soaked doorstep at 3 in the morning that he was done performing privacy. She walked toward him and felt with each step the accumulated weight of everything that had brought them to this particular morning: the midnight candle, the ivory paper, Alice's magnificent and catastrophic carelessness, the trail of ink that had traced its way back to her, the rain, the windows, the willow, the study at Thornfield Park, the slow and mutual and slightly terrifying business of 2 guarded people learning to be known. She reached him. "You are thinking," he said quietly, low enough for only her. "Always," she said. Something moved across his face, brief and warm and entirely unguarded. "What about?" "How thoroughly Alice has destroyed and improved my life simultaneously." From the front pew, as though she had heard, which, knowing Alice, she may well have, came a sound that was half laugh and half sob, quickly suppressed. The ceremony was simple. The words were old and honest and had survived centuries of human use precisely because they contained, beneath their formal surface, something that remained permanently true. Kira listened to them with the translator's habit of attending to what language actually meant rather than what it performed, and found that they meant, on this particular morning, exactly what they said. When it was done, and the small congregation had moved into the pale November courtyard for the modest gathering that followed, Kira found a moment of quietness near the stone wall at the garden's edge. She did not seek it deliberately. It arrived, the way the best quiet moments do, between one thing and the next. Joseph found her there. Of course he did. He had, she reflected, become rather expert at finding her. He held out a letter. Small, folded once, her name on the outside in his precise, careful hand, the hand of a man who wrote, as he did everything else, with complete intention. "You are not to read it now," he said. She looked at it, looked at him. "When?" "When the world is loud and you want to remember that someone sees you in the quiet of it." A pause, the grey eyes steady and warm and entirely present. "Consider it a translation of everything I am not yet fluent enough to say aloud." Kira took the letter, held it with the particular care she reserved for things that contained something true and irreplaceable. She thought of a candle burning to nothing, of ink bleeding onto ivory paper at midnight, of the raw, trembling truth a person carries for years before they finally find the one reader it was always meant for. She looked up at the man who had come to her door in the rain and never, in any way that mattered, left. "I will not burn this one," she said. Joseph looked at her, open, unhurried, entirely home. "No," he said softly, "neither will I." The end. And there it is. From a candle burned down to nothing, to a letter that was never meant to be sent. From a rain-soaked doorstep at 3 in the morning to a quiet November ceremony where 2 of the most guarded people in all of London finally, irrevocably let themselves be seen. Kira and Joseph's story is proof that the most life-changing moments rarely announce themselves. Sometimes they arrive in the form of a sister's careless rush to the post, an anonymous confession on ivory paper, and a duke who loved deeply enough to stand in the rain and wait. Thank you, genuinely and from the heart, for spending this time with them, for following every stolen glance, every careful silence, every hard-won truth spoken in dimly lit rooms and beneath willow trees. Stories like this one only live fully when they find the right readers, and you were exactly that. If Kira's ink and Joseph's quiet, patient love moved something in you, let us know in the comments below. Tell us your favorite moment. Tell us which chapter broke you open a little. Tell us where in the world you are reading from, because this community spans further than you know, and every single comment reminds us why we tell these stories in the first place. If you are not yet part of the family, hit that subscribe button right now, and do not forget to turn on the notification bell so you are the first to know when our next story arrives. The next door is already waiting. The next candle is already lit. We will see you there.